or email Marie. Okay, so I'm here today. Karen Broadhurst, I'm co-lead of the Community Catalyst, and I'm joined by Grace and Marie from Swansea. We're helping with today's webinar, and also our speaker, Will Cook. We'll be with you just as soon as we think participants have joined. Numbers are still going up, so we'll hang on for another 2-3 minutes. Okay, Will, I'm going to give you 1 minute notice of starting. I'll introduce you to our audiences, but we'll get going at 12:05. We've got 53 people now having joined us. Okay, everyone, it's 12:05, so welcome to today's event. I know many of you will have joined us before, but for those of you who haven't joined us, this is a webinar in our evaluation research series, and as you know, we're funded by ADR England and by foundations. I'm delighted to be running this Community Catalyst for ADR England. Got a really exciting event today. We're delighted to welcome Will Cook. Will is a reader at MMU in policy evaluation. He has a really interesting dual career, previously served as economic advisor to the Prime Minister's strategy unit at the Home Office, and has also worked in other various government and public sector roles. Will is going to talk to us today, give us lots of insights today about using administrative data for policy evaluation research, and the title of his talk is What Works, What Doesn't, and What to Watch Out For. So we're hotly anticipating this talk, Will. Just also a shout out for Will's Administrative Data Policy Hub, APSOP, at MMU. So for those of you today who are interested, particularly our northern colleagues, but obviously across UK, a group at MMU are very excited to be creating a hub where colleagues can come together and share insights, share knowledge, skills, etc. around the use of admin data for policy evaluation research. So do get in touch with Will after today's session. So the usual format for the session is that we're recording. So Marie, I think you've already set off the recording. We've got microphones, we've got cameras off, but please use the Q&A to post your questions as we go along. We're giving Will 25-30 minutes flexibly, whatever you need, Will, and then that'll be followed up by 15 minutes Q&A, and Grace will be facilitating the Q&A today. And we'll finish when we're finished. We might run till 1 or we might stop before. Okay, Will, delighted that you're joining us. Very excited about your talk, and over to you.
Thanks a lot, Karen. So hi everyone. Thank you very much for coming to listen to me and giving me the opportunity to talk about kind of my work. As Karen said, I started my career in government, and it was a really exciting time of government that I worked in. It was the kind of Blair era when government was very much about identifying social problems, designing solutions, bringing together stakeholders, and importantly, putting a lot of money behind solving policy issues. And I think that's kind of really driven kind of my interest in admin data and policy evaluation, because actually a lot of those very interesting policies were never really properly evaluated, partly because we didn't really have the tools to do so, but now we do. So my talk's going to be about just kind of briefly discussing that, where you might kind of look for some ideas around kind of doing long-term policy evaluation. I'm going to talk about work that I've done in the past doing policy evaluation, work that I've recently published, and ways of getting around sort of sometimes the problems that we have with admin data. And finally, I'm going to talk about 2 current projects that I'm currently working on that are working on evaluating 2 quite high-profile policies. One is the 2-child limit, and the second is the free schools policy of the current of the previous government. Um, so just to start off with, as you're probably aware of as admin data researchers, or if you're not, through ADR, we now have an incredible resource to work with. Like internationally, it's kind of a leader. We're a leader in the UK in terms of what we have available. Um, so I think people often think, well, the real key benefit of that is we can now evaluate policies while they happen. When I started in government, if you look back at some of the evaluation reports back then, there wasn't really the data to do the sort of proper evaluation that we can do these days. But these days we can, because we have the detailed sort of data that's available through ADR. But often that data isn't is it takes some time to get hold of. So where I really think the advantage of having this wide kind of range of admin data available comes from is actually being able to look back into the past and ask questions. One, did that policy work at the time? But even more interestingly, using the fact that these admin data sets are often linked over time within individuals, we can ask the question, what was the long-term impact of particular policies? Now, you might have seen recently the evaluation that the IFS did of Sure Start, which I think is a really exciting example of this. A major government program that was implemented in the early 2000s, had a lot of confidence of the people who designed it. It was then cut in 2010 because there wasn't really the evidence to support the billions of pounds that were going into it. Step forward admin data and some talented researchers, years later, we then had a really interesting evaluation report that showed the long-term effect of that large-scale government investment uh, back in the early 2000s. And I think that if you're thinking of approaching this kind of area of long-term policy evaluation, you can look back in time and see there's been really three phases of government policy and intervention. There's the early kind of New Labour period when there was quite heavy sort of direct intervention, and that's what the Sure Start kind of evaluation refers to. You then had periods of increasing competition and choice in public services, like league tables, naming and shaming, and things like that. And then post 2010, you had austerity, you had cuts to welfare, increasing marketisation of public services. So there's loads of public policy questions that are sitting back there in the past that we now have the admin data to be able to evaluate and to trace the long-term effect of. So, much of my work or thinking around my work is looking back at those policies and asking the question, what was the effect of those policies then? But as most of my research involves children, it's also asking the question, what was the long-term effect on people's lives of things like Sure Start, of things like the two-child limit, etc. So if you are interested in this sort of work, what I'd advise you to do is delve into the government web archive. That's what I did. Looked around there, look for policy announcements, look for evaluation reports, look for examples where there's rollouts, where there's pilots, where there's targeted programs or certain eligibility criteria. Once you have those things, there's a set of evaluation methods that you can use to evaluate policy. And I'm going to talk about how I've used those sort of structures of policy to do long-term policy evaluation. So I'm going to start off with by talking about what really got me interested in doing this idea of looking back in time and evaluating old policies. In 2018, I got funding from the Nuffield Foundation to evaluate policies around early secondary education. So that's ages of 11 to 14. The idea behind it is that age in children's lives is often thought of as an age that kind of might solidify certain trajectories in terms of life chances and educational outcomes, but at the same time is often ignored in terms of policy because it's not end of primary school, it's not taking GCSEs. So what I did in this project was try to evaluate policies that try to reduce the effect of educational disadvantage during those ages. Now, through my research on the government web archive, I found that there was a policy in 2012 that had implemented summer schools for disadvantaged pupils. The idea was that if you had a summer school run by a secondary school for pupils that are at the end of primary school, this would smooth their transition into secondary school, and you would support educational trajectories which tend to fall off once pupils transition into secondary school. There were only a select number of schools that ran these secondary summer schools that got the funding to do them. So I immediately had a comparison: schools that ran these summer schools versus schools that did not. If you looked at the original evaluation, I found quite positive effects of these summer schools that said that these summer schools improved school readiness, they improved secondary school engagement, and were a possible means by which we could reduce educational disadvantage over the primary secondary school transition. So what I did was I obtained the list of participating schools from the original evaluator. I accessed the National Pupil Database and matched that list into the National Pupil Database and created a treatment group that was pupils that went to secondary schools that run these summer schools versus pupils who went to other schools. And the results of this analysis is on the right-hand side of your screen there. So what I did is I mainly analysed the absence rate of pupils that had been eligible for these summer schools versus those who had not, and that's the treatment versus control in the chart. I've split down the pupil groups into those who are eligible for pupil premium versus all other pupils. As you can see from the results, if you look at the absence rates going from primary school, so that's in year 5, year 6, going into secondary school, you can see that the treatment versus control, it's virtually nothing. Okay, in fact, pupils in the treatment group seem to have, the pupil premium pupils seem to have slightly higher absence rates going into secondary school. I mean, that's the graphical depiction of what I did here, but analytically, I use match difference in difference models to show what is shown in the chart. That essentially this policy, which had been claimed to have a positive effect on the secondary school transition, actually didn't seem to have any impact on a proxy for school engagement, which is school attendance. And then that led me to ask, well, why didn't this policy kind of work? And then I did a bit more research and found that actually the policy had a real difficulty in attracting the pupils that it was actually intended to help, which is pupils who are eligible for pupil premium. And just by looking back, using the admin data that we now have available, I was able to say this policy, which initially seemed like it was very, very positive, actually, we can evaluate it using the data that's now available, using a longitudinal record in the National Pupil Database, and we find that there's no effect. Often, if you look back in time, evaluation reports are very positive about policies if they haven't used robust quasi-experimental techniques. And I think one of the advantages of admin data is that we can go back and actually scrutinize a lot of those claims, like I did in this study. So that was using the National Pupil Database, one of the flagship ADR data sets. Now, I hope ADR don't mind me saying this, but actually you don't always need to use the secure microdata that is available through the ADR flagship data sets. In fact, from my experience of working on kind of older policies and long-term policy evaluation, it's often good to think outside those restricted admin data sets, at least in the first instance. The reason for that is that often there's a long wait to get hold of data. And also that many of the methods that we use in policy evaluation, the feasibility of those methods are often only revealed once you get access to the data. So it often makes sense, before you spend all that time putting in an application, say for the MPD, for eChild, etc., check to see whether there are aggregate stats that are available to just do some preliminary testing on your work to see whether there are interesting results that might come forward, to see whether your method's going to work. Again, at the school level, if you're not aware, there's detailed school level admin data freely available online that you don't need to apply for. But also, if you look back through the National Archives and the Government Web Archive, there's actually a lot of data on there as well. And just to give an example of a study that I did that used publicly available data, didn't use secure microdata at all, was my study of evaluating the impact of school disruption. The background behind this project was COVID. So when COVID hit, obviously schools got locked down, and it was uncharted territory in the sense that we didn't really know what was going to be the impact on school pupils. And because we didn't really know what the impact was, it was very difficult to design policy around how we might mitigate the impacts of those lockdowns. Now, from my work from the Nuffield project, from hanging around and looking around the Government Web Archive, I'd become aware that actually COVID wasn't the first time that schools had been disrupted by a pandemic. In fact, back in 2001, some of you might remember the foot and mouth disease pandemic, not amongst humans, but amongst cattle. And this caused widespread disruption in rural areas. I say widespread, it wasn't really widespread. It was in very, very specific areas of the country. And what the idea I had there is that maybe we could learn from that experience of the foot and mouth disease disruption, because some further research revealed that actually were some schools that were severely disrupted by the controls around movement in rural areas. So what I did, I looked into what was publicly available, and sure enough, in the Government Web Archive, I found a list of schools that were deemed to be severely disrupted by restrictions caused by the foot and mouth disease epidemic amongst cattle. I matched that to publicly available information on Key Stage 2 performance and implemented a difference in difference design on the data. On the right there, you'll see the results of the difference in difference study. And if you're aware of what difference in difference is, this is an event study. If you're not aware of what difference in difference estimates provide, essentially what I've done here is I've compared the performance of schools that were impacted by the restrictions caused by the epidemic versus schools that weren't affected. You'll see in the dashed line is when the foot and mouth disease crisis hit. So you see in the years before the crisis, after adjustments, there was no difference in Key Stage 2 performance between schools that turned out to be affected by the crisis versus schools that were not. You'll see in the year of the crisis, 2001, there wasn't really an effect either. But actually, the year afterwards, there was this huge-ish drop in primary school performance amongst those schools affected by restrictions caused by this agricultural crisis. And then after the crisis, you'll see that performance never really goes back to where it was prior to the crisis, although those differences are not statistically significant. Further work, if you look into the results in the paper that I've quoted there, you will see that the main impact was on maths and not so much on reading. And it turned out to be quite a nice result, because this actually ended up predicting what would be the differential effect of the school lockdowns for COVID as well. A greater effect on maths compared to reading. And if you look into the paper, you'll see there's various reasons for that. But I think kind of what I learned from that study is that you don't always need the secure microdata to produce policy relevant research. You can try out ideas, And as long as you do your research on those past policies, it's often easy, or it's often you often get lucky and find these opportunities to produce things that are going to be relevant to policy. Um, yeah. Okay. Um, just move on to my next slide. Okay. So they're kind of two of my examples. The first one was about using the MPD to evaluate an old policy on summer schools. The second one was about using aggregate data to really draw out lessons for policy today. And one of the things I would say is that often policies today usually have some sort of historical analog. So most policy design or policy crises aren't actually that new. We've experienced them before. And instead of waiting, for the policy to be implemented or for the crisis to play out, it's often worth kind of researching what the kind of historical parallels and investigating whether we can analyze those questions using the admin data at hand. Now, I'm going to give another example here of where I didn't go into the secure microdata, another kind of technique that you can use to get very quick results on policy as a means of possibly doing some further, more detailed admin data analysis later. So you might be aware of a policy called the two child limit or the two child benefit cap. So this was a policy implemented in April 2017 where universal credit or child tax credit was limited to children to families with two children or less. So if a family had more than two children, they wouldn't get additional per child universal credit or child tax credit as part of their welfare benefits. And at the point of abolition, which was, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, I think that was worth just over £3,500 a year per child. So quite a hefty sort of change in benefit eligibility. I think myself and a number of other researchers have noted that the way that this policy was implemented meant that we can apply quasi-experimental methods, because whether your household was affected by the two-child limit or not was completely dependent on the birth date of the third or higher order child. Essentially, if a child was born on or after the 6th of April 2017, they weren't eligible for the benefit. Whereas if they were born before that date, your household was eligible for the benefit. So I wanted to investigate this, but the existing data sources weren't really appropriate for investigating the impact of this policy. The labour force survey, for instance, too small a sample and didn't really have the variables necessary to identify who was affected by the policy or not. So what I did identify was the census. So the census taken in 2021 includes detail about household composition, and it includes detail about the sort of outcomes that I was interested in. In this case, it was labour market outcomes, like employment, inactivity, etc. But accessing the whole census is pretty challenging. It's easy. Well, you can access the 10% sample through the SRS, but accessing the whole thing in order to do this sort of methods is a bit difficult. So what I did was I commissioned bespoke tables from the ONS of counts by month of birth. So I requested counts by month of birth for households with 3 or more children, and a count of whether someone was in work or not in work, and got frequency tables essentially associated with birth month, bearing in mind that birth month was the key determinant of whether someone was affected by the two-child limit. Using those counts, I then expanded those counts to produce essentially synthetic microdata that would reflect the underlying microdata, but wasn't the microdata, in order to perform the analysis. And on the next slide, you'll see my key result from this research. So on the x-axis here, you have the month of birth, and that is centered around April 2017. So that's the date of birth as to whether a family was affected by the two-child limit or not. And all the households on this chart are households with a third child born on one of those months of birth. So each dot there refers to household with a third child born on whatever month that corresponds to. So any households to the right would have been affected by the two-child limit. Any of the households to the left would not have been affected by the two-child limit. On the y-axis is the percentage of mothers in the family who are economically active. And you'll see that there's this declining trend of economic activity as you increase the birth month. That's just a mechanical thing because the census was collected in 2021. And as you go up the birth month towards 2021, the children get younger and mothers are less likely to be in work. But the key result here is that discontinuity around the month of birth being April 2017. You'll see the blue dots, they're the unaffected families, and the red dots, the affected families, and this jump upwards in economic activity rate at that point where the two-child limit kicked in. So what these results showed using regression discontinuity methods, a quasi-experimental method, is that the two-child limit had this small effect on increasing economic inactivity. Now, this was all based on aggregate data. It was, like I said, it was counts I'd requested from the ONS. I had intended then to use census microdata and the newly available rapid data that ADR have facilitated the availability of. Unfortunately, I didn't get funding to expand this project, but I think it's a demonstration that you can start with the aggregate data, start with less secure data, and use it to test out ideas. In this case, I've got a result, and then I can then go into more detailed microdata and flagship data sets to test out more detailed research questions. And that's exactly what I'm doing for another project, looking at the two-child limit using exactly the same methods, but this time I am going to use secure microdata. So continuing on from my interest in the two-child limit, one of the projects I'm currently working on is to estimate the impact of the two-child limit on child outcomes, using exactly the same thinking, exactly the same method that I used in the previous example of testing the impact of the two-child limit on employment outcomes. I'm looking to see whether there's a discontinuity in childhood outcomes depending on whether a household was just affected by the two-child limit or it was just not affected, depending on the birth date of the third child in the family. It's a simple sort of quasi-experimental method. Unfortunately, the MPD, as it stands, does not have the data available to say whether a child is a third child in the family or how many children are in the family, etc. So on the face of it, it looks like you couldn't do that sort of analysis in the National Pupil Database. But what I did is I contacted the DFE and said, can we enhance the data and can we produce sibling identifiers within the MPD in order to do this research? And fortunately, because there's a historical precedent of doing sibling identifiers in the MPD, they've agreed to it. And Fisher Family Trust Education Data Lab are currently, I think they're almost finished doing the work of creating those sibling identifiers in the MPD. And so that's something that we funded as part of this project, that you as researchers will be able to use those sibling identifiers once they're in the MPD as well. And because we now have those sibling identifiers, I can say, here's a family where a third child was born on the 6th of April 2017. They were probably affected by the two-child limit because we know at the time from other bits of information in the MPD that they were eligible for free school meals. And again, it's just simply applying the method in my paper on labour market statistics, educational outcomes, will be able to test the impact of the two-child limit on all the detailed outcomes that we have in the National Pupil Database, like attendance, exclusion, test results. We're also going to link it to the MOJ DFE data share and test the impact on crime as well. So I kind of think the lesson kind of that for me is that if what you need isn't there, just ask for it and work with the data owners to see whether they can facilitate your project. It's something I hadn't really considered before this project, but you know, it's something that I certainly would recommend. So that's kind of one of the projects that I'm currently working on: regression discontinuity of the impact of the two-child limit on children. A project that has just come to an end, but I'm still doing some of the analysis and the writing up, is a UKRI funded project on the impact of free schools. So again, using the MPD, this is applying quasi-experimental methods of RDD and difference in difference to test whether the implementation of the free schools policy, that was about 15 years ago it started, had any impact on children's outcomes. So if you're not aware, free schools were new schools that could be set up without a predecessor school. The most famous of which you might have heard of is perhaps the Michaela Community School. And the idea was that these free schools would inject innovation, particularly in disadvantaged areas, to improve outcomes. So what we've done with that data, we've done difference in difference of cohorts over time. Because these are new schools, you'll have cohorts that couldn't attend the school because it wasn't open, and then suddenly there'd be a year when a cohort could attend that school. So you have cohort to cohort variation. We've also looked within families as well to say, well, an older sibling couldn't attend that school, but a younger sibling could, simply because the school opened between their ages. And we can do comparisons within families to say, did the older sibling have better or worse outcomes compared to the younger sibling in areas where they were eligible to join free schools? And we've published a report on that, and it's generally positive about the impact of free schools. A lot of good work's gone into that. Unfortunately, free schools have been kind of killed off as a policy. And so it was a bit deflating when we got to the end of the project and found that actually no one was really talking about free schools anymore. But then I found out a couple of weeks ago that our research has been kind of quoted in a parliamentary debate around education policy. And I think kind of one of the things I have learned working in this sort of space for a number of years is that don't be disheartened if no one's interested in your policy relevant work. It's usually just part of a cycle. If no one's interested in the moment, it will be an issue in a couple of years' time. A classic example of that is grammar schools. Nobody's talking about grammar schools and academic selection at the moment. So if you're researching that area, don't be disheartened, because in a couple of years ago, it will be the big issue that everyone will be wanting sort of evidence on. And that applies to other kind of areas of historical policy as well. Just because a policy that happened in the past doesn't seem relevant today, these things continuously come around and will be of interest. Another example of that is school attendance. School attendance was a major issue in, say, 2007, 2008. People researched it and then it disappeared off the policy and research radar. Fast forward, to 15, 13 years, COVID happened. Suddenly school attendance is the massive kind of educational issue, and we don't really have enough evidence to back up what works, what doesn't, what to consider on that. Okay, I just want to finish off by talking about a negative experience I suppose I've had with trying to get hold of admin data, and with the message that I think it'd be good if we were better at sharing these difficulties. So a couple of years ago, I had an idea of doing some evaluation work of the National Child Measurement Programme. National Child Measurement Programme is a programme to measure the height and weight of reception and Year 6 children. And I wanted to test whether providing feedback to parents on healthy weight status in reception had any impact on weight gain or loss over primary school. It's a brilliant data set because it records height and weight and a few other details for virtually all English school children. It'd be really interesting to link it to the MPD, but I'm pretty sure there are reasons why that can't be done. I thought I had a clever idea to access it by making a similar request like I did to the ONS to request frequency counts from which I could reconstruct some microdata. Had a meeting with the NHS, they were broadly supported, went through lots of forms, told I'd submitted the wrong form, to submit a different form, and heard nothing, followed up, and then was told actually we can't share any of this data with you at all, which kind of wasted quite a lot of time. I've kind of found that other researchers have had kind of success at accessing this data at very much a local level, but unfortunately, kind of like the kind of interaction I've had with them, they seem not so keen on sharing the accesses that they've had to that data. So I think that the kind of one of the things I kind of want to finish off with is that with a lot of policy evaluation, you often need to do something innovative, either to enhance the data that's already there or to request extra data that doesn't currently exist. And, you know, if we can share those sort of difficulties or barriers and kind of think about ways of working around them, or to try and persuade the data owners to release certain variables or variables in a certain form that will facilitate better policy evaluation, I think that will be beneficial to all of us. So it's just a summary slide to finish off with. That I think if you're doing policy evaluation on admin data, the important thing to do is to find out what data is available outside of just the secure microdata that you're looking at, because you can often do some preliminary work based on aggregate publicly available data. And it's also really important to really understand the policies that you're evaluating to see if they were implemented as intended or not. I'd also say that there'll be policies announced today that you'll think, well, we can't evaluate that until a few years into the future. But often there are historical analogues of most policies that are announced. So you can look back in time and say, what can we learn from the past to inform things today? And I guess I've already covered talking about kind of sharing our difficulties in access, but my last point is about working with data owners. Data owners have made their data available in order to facilitate better evidence for policy. I think they're possibly more open than I'd first realised about enhancements to data sets or better understanding of data sets in order to do that. So I'll stop there and welcome any questions anyone might have.
Lovely, thank you, Will. That was that was fascinating and really interesting to hear about all your kind of innovative workarounds and attempts to get to data in the face of the obstacles that we find. I'm going to hand over to Grace, because Grace is going to go into the Q&A and the chat and extract some questions to start with.
Yes, so we've got some Q&As already, but if you haven't already, please do put them in. So Joanne asks, do you collect any qualitative data around policies? How do you implement these into your evaluation reports? And how are these weighted in comparison to any quantitative data?
So personally, I wouldn't collect qualitative data in the sense that going out there and doing primary qualitative research. What I have done, one of the things I think you have to do in any sort of policy analysis is to do really detailed documentary research. You've got to understand what the policy is and how it was implemented. Many of my ideas to do long-term policy evaluation have been ruined by doing that first step, because you soon realize that what looks like a really good policy evaluation study it isn't, because actually the allocation rules for certain policies, the targeting rules for certain policies weren't followed. And it's typically because an MP might say, hey, why isn't this program in my constituency? And that just messes up your whole kind of difference in difference or regression discontinuity. I have also contacted people who worked on older policies and asked them for details about how it was implemented. So I guess the answer to the question is no, I wouldn't use qualitative evidence in the evaluation, but to understand, what us economists call the institutional background, it is absolutely crucial to do that documentary and, if possible, find the people who are actually involved in the policy and how it was implemented, because that will make and break whether your policy evaluation makes sense.
That's such important advice, Will. Grace, we've got another question.
Yeah, so this one I think is in relation to your first example you gave about the summer school transitions and how there was no effect in the findings. So someone's asked, is it not because there's no effect because the implementation was not properly done? So is the real response that there is no evidence of the effect, or that there could never be evidence of the effect?
Okay, so that's a good question. So I think so this policy was focused on disadvantaged pupils. So what they found in the evaluation was that actually there was a reasonable attendance at these summer schools, but not the people that they would have targeted it at. So I had to change my evaluation strategy, because originally it was going to be comparing disadvantaged pupils versus non-disadvantaged pupils in the same school, and that would have been sort of meaningless. So in the case of disadvantaged pupils, yes, they didn't turn up. So in a way, that is the finding from that. But for the wider group of pupils, there was reasonable attendance of these summer schools. And even though it wasn't 100%, it is in, medical trial kind of terminology, it was like an intent to treat sort of estimate. And so if there was any sort of meaningful effect, I would have expected to have seen that in that broader sample of the analysis. So my sense is that this policy didn't have an effect, but the key learning from it was actually that, if you want to provide additional provision for disadvantaged pupils, there has to be better targeting or better kind of incentives to attend. In fact, a similar issue is with the Sure Start evaluation as well, in that Sure Start was targeted in deprived neighbourhoods to disadvantaged families, but actually the attendance of it didn't fully reflect that policy intention.
We've got a question then about when you've looked at education outcomes. So how have you accounted for changes in attainment for grading? So, for example, government reforms tightening around exams, that sort of thing.
I'm trying to think of where we might have done that. I mean, in our most recent projects, looking at the free schools impacts, one of the problems we did have was that you have this shift of GCSEs from A star to G to 1 to 9, which was really annoying. And the only way we dealt with that was by separating out the sample into the two groups. I think when I've worked with Key Stage 2 data, you can zero center the marks for Key Stage 2 tests, so that if something happens year to year, then you're controlling for that in the analysis, and you're essentially looking for variation within each year. But again, that is one of those examples where we can't just look at admin data and just take it at face value. We really need to understand the institutional framework behind what we're reading, because it's such a good point that an A star one year in the data set may not be the same as an A star next year. That's certainly started with GCSEs, for instance. What counted as a a GCSE to be included in performance tables have changed significantly over the last 15 years. Like vocational qualifications used to be in there, now they're not. So you really do need to, we can't just approach these things as quantitative analysts. We need to understand, the broader education policy as well, which, as I said, does involve going back into kind of archive sort of like research.
So you've got lots and lots of really nice positive comments thanking you, saying it was such a fantastic talk and fascinating. And then we've had a couple more questions in. So one is around the sibling data that you mentioned that's coming into the MPD. Can you give any more detail as to what info the identifiers will contain and any timeline insights?
So unfortunately, I can't. I wish I could have the timeline, but I don't have the timeline just yet. But what the way I've commissioned it is that there are already sibling identifiers in the MPD. They were done, I think, in 2007-08 and 2015 and 16. So the reason I'm commissioning them now is because they won't cover families that are affected by the 2-child limit. So it's really a repeat of those previous sibling IDs. So if you go into the, I don't know if people are aware, there's a Find and Explore website that the DFE have, which allows you to look into all the different variables that are in the MPD. If you look at the sibling variables from 07-08 and 15-16, it's going to be similar to those variables. Most importantly for me, it is simply an ID that links together pupils within the MPD on a shared sort of household ID.
And then Christina has asked, identifying unintended consequences, surely you would need to carry out some qualitative work to see why this has emerged. So I think this was in relation to the first question where you are asked about qualitative work. Do you carry out that in addition to the quant?
Yeah, is that in response to any particular research study? Or is it just...
Christina, do you want me to unmute so you can ask Will or put it in the chat? The first one. Okay, so the summer schools transitions.
Yeah, but the qualitative research, I mean, but this is kind of the issue with doing long-term policy evaluation. It's difficult. Like, what are we now? Well, that's 14 years later to do any sort of qualitative research. So you are kind of reliant on what was collected at the time. Luckily for that particular policy, there was a government commissioned evaluation, and in fact, that was what mainly was evaluations back then and further back. It was mainly qualitative research. So I don't think there is much of a role to do that now. It might be that in some cases, yeah, but you're essentially doing historical research and trying to find the people who are involved. So it does have to be based on what was available at the time. But I would say that the government web archive is really, really detailed. That I sometimes wonder whether I'm the only person who just spends my time kind of like hanging out there. But it's got captures of almost every government web page, like each week, like 2003, and it has press announcements, it has evaluation reports, it has loads of stuff on there, and there's a lot you can find on that. And back then, the government commissioned a lot more research and evaluation than it does now. So you can find a lot of qualitative research and qualitative evaluation of policies there.
So linking to that, someone's asked if there is a record of the key policy changes or reforms over time. So is that on the website as well, or you'd have to do digging for that?
Yeah. So I seemed just before this talk, I seem to remember I was thinking about this, and that someone, I think it was Ruth Lupton at University of Manchester, may have done a study on social policy during the Blair era, which I think does go through I'll see if I can find it and I'll send it to the group afterwards. It does go kind of through a list of all the different things that were done social policy wise, between 2000 and 2010. So there's that. But when I talk about the web archive, I mean it's a real mess. You've got to go kind of really kind of explore it in there. I can't think there's a kind of good place to go, whether there's you know a detailed list of these policies. It's just you have a look around.
And thank you, Will. So we've got one more question, and it's relating again to the siblings and the MPD. They've asked if you know if there's any developments of any other family benefits data, and that would be both public and secure.
Of any what? Sorry, I missed that. Any what?
Developments in family benefits data. So is it something you can get in the Rapid, or do you know?
So I see Rapid will have that sort of data, but unfortunately that's not linked to the MPD, and also that's done. It's difficult. There's an issue with connecting individuals in the Rapid data because unless it's a household level benefit, you don't see who in the household that the individual's linked to. Now there is a data set, and this is kind of when I was saying like we should help each other, right? That there is a data set that exists that links the MPD with DWP data. It's called the Parent Pupil Match Data Set. It's used in government, has been used for research report, but it's not, researchers can't access it. I say yet, but I mean, I heard about this about 5 years ago, and they're saying we're going to release it for researchers. It still hasn't been released. I mean, I'm sure there's good reasons why not. But that would be, would real step change in the sort of things we could do with educational data. Because at the moment we just work, as those who work in this area know, we work with free school meals as the main indicator of disadvantage. Whereas if we had the PPMD, that would link to potentially household income, specific benefits they're claimed for health and disability, from being out of work, etc. A lot more detailed analysis we do. We could do a lot more of the linking to see whether welfare policy changes affected children at school as well. So, that does exist. It's just we don't have access to it yet. So, let's all join together and campaign to release the data.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Brilliant.
Okay, great. So we're at the end of questions, and we've just beautifully fitted this into the hour, Will. So well done for that as well. Will, thanks for your enthusiasm. Thanks for all your tips and advice. Really, really helpful. Obviously, this recording will be made available for people so they can follow up on some of the advice you've given. But I found that incredibly informative. Great to have you signpost various little resources that people don't know about. And I think your final kind of words of advice about us working together to help each other out, to shortcut some of the duplicated effort, wasted time, and also to campaign for really key resources that government could release is very welcome too. Okay, so thank you. Any final comment from you, Will, before we wrap up?
No, just thanks for everyone to attending, and I'm very happy if people want to get in contact with me about anything I've spoken about today.
Great. So you know where Will is and where Will's Hub is. And just to say that our next Catalyst event is on the 13th of May. And this is about responsible and meaningful use of administrative data. So again, look out for this, look out for adverts on our microsite with ADR UK, ADR England. And obviously Marie is here. You know where Marie is if you want to ask any further questions about that. Thanks again, Will, and thanks to everybody for attending. A great event. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.